Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is Marcia Daszko. She's a speaker, a workshop facilitator, a consultant, and an author. So for more than 25 years, she has been speaking, consulting, and guiding executive teams in Fortune 500 companies, private corporations, the education sector, the U.S. Navy, and nonprofit organizations to achieve exponential success. She was mentored by Dr. W. Edwards Deming. She was nominated for the International Deming Prize, and Marcia writes a leadership column for the Silicon Valley Business Journal. She's taught MBA classes at 6 universities, and I'm going to mention 2 books. She's author most recently of the book. Those of you watching on YouTube can see the cover and the image behind her. It's Pivot, Disrupt, Transform: How Leaders Beat the Odds and Survive. And Marcia was also the co-author previously of a book titled Turning Ideas into Impact: Insights from 16 Silicon Valley Consultants. So Marcia, thank you for joining us here. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me today.
I'm happy we could connect, and people who know me in this podcast, when they heard Dr. Deming's name at the beginning, they're not surprised that you and I are going to have a conversation. That's why you're here on the podcast. And I like to ask people their origin story. I would love to hear your origin story of first taking interest in Dr. Deming's work and then getting connected to Dr. Deming.
Certainly. That's an interesting journey. Not one that I planned for. So many people have a plan and they live their plan. I didn't do that.
Yeah.
I did a pivot. So my first career was corporate communications and marketing and some teaching. And then I started working for a small consulting company owned by Dr. Perry Gluckman. And I was doing marketing. And then one day he said, I want you to do business development. I said, what am I selling? And he sent me off to Dr. Deming's 4-day seminar. And that was in the 1980s. And so I went to that. And then I came back to the office and said, Perry, what was that about? Because
Yeah.
there were words that Dr. Deming was using that I had never heard before, like variation and systems thinking and the red beads and so forth. And so he said, don't worry, I'll teach you. And Dr. Deming was at the time in his 80s,
Right.
teaching these 4-day seminars to as many as like 1,500 managers and executives from all across any sector, from nonprofits to military to corporate, nonprofit, education, healthcare. We covered it all. And so that's when I had my first introduction. And then Perry was helping me learn. And so I was reading 5 to 10 books a week that he approved of. He said, yes, these are great. No, don't read that. That's junk about TQM quality and so forth. So I studied and studied, and Perry and I would have conversations of 3, 4, 5 hours talking about Dr. Deming's concepts and philosophy of management and how to apply it. And Perry was working with companies like HP and 3Com and so forth to help those executives learn and apply.
Mm-hmm.
So then I said to him, I after a few months, I want to go hear Dr. Deming again. So off I went to another 4-day seminar. And then I was introduced to him by Dr. Nancy Mann, who was running the workshops or hosting. And he said, then she said to Dr. Deming, Marcia works with Perry. Well, they were friends. And Dr. Deming looked at me and he said, oh, good, then I will teach you. And I was extremely shy at the time and thought, oh, no, I don't want to be a statistician. And so then, but he said to me, come as often as you can to the 4-day to learn. And I ended up going to 20 of his 4-day seminars,
Wow.
and then co-founded the Bay Area Deming User Group. And we met monthly for about 18 years to talk about every month. We'd have a speaker, and then we would talk about Dr. Deming's philosophy and how to apply it. And that was many people from Silicon Valley companies would attend, and sometimes we had 30 attendees, sometimes 100. It, varied over time. So that was my introduction, and then I was working with Perry then to help other people learn and apply Dr. Deming's philosophy as I was learning too. So it was great.
So did you end up, I've interviewed people who say they assisted Dr. Deming during the workshops. Did you kind of graduate to a role where he had you helping him and not just sitting there in the audience each time?
It was interesting. Yes, I helped with registration and so forth initially, and on the side of the podium where or the stage where Dr. Deming sat, there were usually 4 rows of helpers and facilitators. And so a couple of people in the first row would be like Dr. Brian Joyner, Dr. Ed Baker, Dr.
Wow.
Bill Schirkenbach, Dr. Gypsy Rainey, some of those people who, Dr. Joyce Orsini, who worked with him closely and who also taught at the university level usually. And then the other rows were people still learning and just helping facilitate however we could, or help at the 4-day. And then gradually, as you learn more and more, you moved up in the rows. So it was fun.
And I've never sat through anybody's workshop anywhere near 20 times. Like I have, a favorite movie of mine that I've watched 20 times, and you kind of, you learn the lines, but the movie is the movie. I guess the question is, how consistent was the 4-day workshop, and you really kind of get to know it by heart, or there's different insights that come out each time?
I think I definitely learned during each 4-day workshop, and there were multiple reasons for that, and those are, from workshop to workshop, Dr. Deming was learning and integrating new ideas, new thinking into his 4-day. That was one thing. Another thing was that the audience questions would stir and spur new thinking and new comments from him, and insights and so forth. And then, so he would speak all day until 4:00, and then the facilitator would put us in working groups, and the working groups would go from like 4:00. Some would finish, they would ask questions, and we were supposed to then go into teams and work on those answers to the questions, write them on an index card and turn them in. And Dr. Deming would, those teams would share the next morning. And so the focus was on our learning, but also Dr. Deming's learning. He was very interested in learning what questions we had about what he had taught the previous day, and what ideas we had about those things. And so it was a lot of mutual sharing, and out of that was the continual learning.
Mhm.
And then on some evenings, Dr. Deming would invite in someone that he wanted to learn from. So, for example, he might have a panel of psychologists, and there would be a facilitator asking them questions because Dr. Deming wanted to learn more about theory of psychology,
Mm.
for example. And so I remember one of those evenings, and Dr. Susan Leddick, who is a psychologist, she asked me to scribe all of the answers. So as people were, as the panelists were answering questions, then I would capture all of that on the flip charts. It was another opportunity for learning for me, because when you're actually writing all those things down, it's a different process in your
Mhm.
brain.
Yeah. And that interactive, not just hearing what Dr. Deming was teaching, but the questions, and yeah, I could see that deepening your
Yes.
understanding of then what people might ask you if you were teaching or coaching or consulting. Yeah.
Yes. Of course, they would have questions that really challenged him, because if they, for example, had performance appraisals and they
Mhm.
were used to ranking and rating and supposedly giving feedback to employees and so forth, but it was in terms of judging and blaming,
Right.
then they would ask questions about that, and he gave answers, but they weren't deep answers. They were they sometimes, the audience struggled to understand his answers because you had to study. You had to really study and think about what he was teaching. It
Hmm.
was not always direct or simple. It
Yeah.
made you think.
Yeah. And I mean, my recollection, having never met Dr. Deming, never had the opportunity to do the 4-day workshop, but mainly through books. And, I think, it seemed like the advice, if he would say, eliminate fear, eliminate annual performance reviews. And the short answer was substitute leadership.
Yes.
And maybe that wasn't a satisfying answer to some
Yes. Yes,
people. Like,
exactly.
wait, more
Exactly.
leaders? Like, well, maybe not that.
Yes. As we hear today, some universities have gotten rid of the need for turning in SAT or ACT, scores when students apply. And I recently heard of two universities who are going to reinstate
Yeah.
using SAT scores for applications. And one was Dartmouth,
Mhm.
and I can't remember the second, but it's back east as well.
Another Ivy League.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I wrote a short letter or short note to one of the presidents, and basically said, you need leadership, not
Mm.
SAT scores.
Yeah.
So I'm probably not helpful either, but I'm like, Dr. Deming saying substitute leadership. And it's like, leaders think about what does really a test score tell us.
Mhm.
They're they're hoping that the test score will tell them that certain applicants have a potential for success,
Mhm.
and that has nothing to do with it, because it's not SAT scores are is not about knowledge,
Mhm.
um, but instead about how fast can you memorize certain things and then forget them.
And in some cases, how much help and coaching do you have about taking the standardized test?
Yes, and that right there, when people have some students have the money to pay for classes or coaches to prime them for those SAT tests, that leaves out a good chunk of the population that can't afford
Right.
those those support
Right.
systems.
Right. So it's not as standardized. It might be a standardized test, but maybe not a standardized system
Exactly.
around that test. And,
Right.
I mean, there's think back to it when you were maybe balking early on of like you didn't want to become a statistician, but Dr. Deming is, of course, I'm sure you figured it out quickly, and he was much more than that. I hear him sometimes described as like, oh, the statistician W. Edwards Deming, and I'm like, oh, that's incomplete.
Right.
He there's lots of other labels we might use, but he did have a lot of really challenging ideas. And I've had an opportunity here in this podcast over time to interview Alfie Kohn,
Mm-hmm.
who has pretty radical ideas about getting rid of grades in school and not robbing people of intrinsic motivation for learning. And then a UCLA professor, Samuel Colbert, who actually was not like directly influenced by Dr. Deming, but he wrote a book about get rid of the performance review. And now, in the 2020s, we hear more about companies, or maybe even in the last decade, more companies doing away with the rigid annual ranking, annual performance review. Like GE doesn't do the Jack Welch
Oh,
rank and yank version,
yes.
which is probably even worse than just doing the annual performance reviews. I mean, what are your observations or thoughts, even just on that point that's still pretty challenging to leaders today, of substituting the annual performance review with something better?
Right. And again, Dr. Deming would say substitute leadership.
Yeah.
And there's a great book written about performance appraisals that I recommend to all my clients too, if they're using them, and that is Abolishing Performance Appraisals by Tom Cohens and Mary Jenkins. And they spent 4 years researching the topic and then writing, and they have examples in there as well about organizations that did abandon the performance appraisals. But the issue is that there are many, many inaccurate assumptions about the value of performance appraisals that people don't think about, don't check out. It's almost like fake data.
Yeah.
And it's like a company, once it has so many employees, they think, oh, we need these certain HR systems in place, and one of them is we need performance management and performance appraisals and so forth. They don't think about what's the aim, by what method, why would
Mhm.
we use that, does it match our culture, what are the values of a performance appraisal, all of those things. They don't ask those questions. They just say, oh, we're this size, now we need these things. More and more and more corporations or organizations are adding quote unquote best practices, trendy
Right.
things, trendy, shiny tools, management fads
Yeah.
into their organizations without thinking about
Yeah.
why or what they are doing or the impact that they will have. And if instead they created a culture that achieved their aim, they would not put in these things. In fact, the first one third of my pivot book is about the things you need to stop doing,
Yeah.
because otherwise it's like adding fresh strawberry jam on moldy toast. If they just want to add any good things onto the bad management fads they already have in place. So they've got to stop a lot of these things that are actually causing waste, complexity,
Mhm.
and dysfunctional cultures
Yeah.
first. So they need to get rid of those things, and if they do that, they can almost automatically see and experience a surge in a healthy culture, a more efficient, effective system, and and a healthier, happier culture.
Yeah.
But they need to get rid of the bad things, and oftentimes they can't see those things. So
Right.
that's why I love when an executive, a leader, calls me and says, Marcia, I need your help, because I can go into an organization. Oftentimes it'll take me a week to assess the organization and give them a summary report and say, these are your major issues. These are your challenges.
Yeah.
These are the barriers to your success or your progress or your happy, healthy culture or your wow experience to your customers. These are the things that are getting in your way,
Yeah.
and they can't see it because they're in the system and they've just adopted bad practices.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to me in different industries, and this isn't just on the performance review issue, but there are default assumptions of how an organization has to operate. People tend to accept or inherit those assumptions and those defaults, and then you propose something different, and then they'll say, well, prove to me, prove to me that this other way is better, when that was never the threshold for adopting the old method. Like,
Right.
it was never proven, it was somehow just adopted. And moving away from that default has, I don't know if it's like a matter of fear, discomfort, of like why that bar is so high. Prove to me that shifting from the status quo is going to be better. Like, you probably realize the status quo is lacking in some way. I mean, what are your thoughts around that component of change? Even with powerful executives, they're sometimes still afraid of doing things a different way. Is it more complicated than that?
Sometimes they're not even aware of their fears, or they're not aware that there's a better way. They're used to the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they have problems, I know one of my clients, a president, said to me one day, Marcia, I've been struggling with these same problems for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you come in and in a month or two are teaching us how to ask different questions, rethink what we've been doing. We see the processes or the that have been impacting these issues and why we keep having the same problems over and over again and we never get to solutions. He said, you give us a different lens to
Mm-hmm.
see through, a different knowledge. You're teaching us to ask different questions. And he said, we're not afraid of change,
Mm-hmm.
but you get us to focus on improving or innovating. And one of the things I say is take the word change out of the vocabulary, because if you talk about change, you instantly are going to drive in fear.
Mm-hmm.
People have a fear of change, fear of loss, fear of the unknown, fear of making mistakes.
Right.
And so you're if that's what it's about, oh, we need to change. We need to, instead of say, pivot that thinking, pivot
Mm-hmm.
the vocabulary, because if you pivot the wording and you talk about how can we improve together as
Right.
a team to give our customers an amazing experience and create new markets, so innovation. We're talking about quality as a business strategy, continual improvement as a business strategy, and innovation as a business strategy.
Mm.
That takes away, if that's the focus, we take away the fear of change and the use of the word change. And change management, it's another management fad.
Mm.
So
So,
I just want people to get rid of change management, performance appraisals,
mhm.
arbitrary numerical goals, because they don't add value. And over time, they will make an organization struggle and decline.
Yeah. When you talk about the word change, and there's this expression I hear a lot, you've probably heard too, pointed at other people or people in the organization that they're resistant to change. I don't like that phrase because I think if someone is detecting, if that seems to be the symptom, there's a much deeper causes to that. But I've never once heard anyone say those people are resistant to improvement.
Exactly.
I mean, because change is not always improvement. I mean, and it's not just the framing of like, oh, if we chose a more positive word, that like there's more to it than that.
Right.
But I think people have had a lot of changes forced on them that weren't improvements, and they remember that. I
Right.
think that's at least part of it.
And Peter Schultes, who wrote the team handbook and the leader's handbook, and he
Mm-hmm.
said, people don't resist change, they resist being changed.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's why I think it's so powerful and important for us to think about the vocabulary that we
Mhm.
use in our organizations.
Yeah.
And that's up to leadership.
Yeah, and thank you for citing Peter Schultes on that. I've quoted and cited him many times in blog posts and articles and books. So thank you for the call out to the late Peter Schultes. I was one other thing I think is really challenging. That comes back to assumptions. Is people often think an individual's performance, whether that's sales numbers or patient experience scores, or that these outcomes are clearly the result of this person's effort and skill and individual performance, as opposed to looking at performance being driven by the system. And to get statistical for a minute, the idea that Deming people understand, or people who've learned from Don Wheeler or others, is most people's performance falls in the range of common cause variation. There might be an outlier, but it's certainly not like a bottom 10% that the old Jack Welch approach would judge and get rid of. But can you share thoughts and reflections on trying to help leaders understand that idea that most performance is driven by systems, not individual effort and skill and dedication?
Yes, that is such a powerful concept. And if leaders don't get that, they're not going to be able to transform or lead.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I do is I don't tell people or even kind of teach people how to think differently about you've got stop measuring the individual and shift to measuring the system. They're not able initially to
Mm-hmm.
wrap their minds around that. They
Mm-hmm.
just can't get away from the individual focus. So what I do is in my leadership classes, and we're developing leadership, understanding, learning about, and I don't always say Dr. Deming's philosophy. I teach that later. Where this new system of management comes from, or this new management philosophy. So what I do is when I when I facilitate their learning to be better leaders, and to be able to create more productive, happier, successful organizations, what I do is I put them into an exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask them, what did you learn? What else? What else? What else? What else? Until they pull the concepts out.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask them, how does this apply to your work, your
Mm-hmm.
job, your organization? And then I do another exercise and do the same and another. So there's a process that I have of learning, facilitating their learning
Mm-hmm.
to put them through the educational concepts. And I don't tell them, okay, now I'm going to teach you such and such, or now look
Yeah.
at these 20 PowerPoint slides and get this, because it's too difficult. They won't, and they will resist then that, well, I've got my MBA from such and such, and I've studied this and that. I read this book that's full of management fads, and there's plenty of those I can rip apart. um, but instead I give them the experience, and
Mm-hmm.
that experiential learning they will never forget. In fact, one of my clients from PBS, who is one of my first clients many years ago, when people from PBS call me, they still say, "Hey, Ms. Hart, how are you doing?" Because I had an exercise where I wore a hard hat,
Uh-huh.
and on the front it said Ms. Hart, and that's what they still call me because they never forgot that exercise. And I basically was teaching the PDSA model, plan,
Mm-hmm.
do, study, act,
Mm-hmm.
and they can implement that
Yeah.
that improvement tool wherever in life
Right.
because
Right.
they experienced it.
Yeah. And then I think another form or another example of experiential learning that can have a great impact, you mentioned earlier, the red bead game or the red bead experiment. But I think sometimes the key question, as you asked it, people learn and they, okay, they're building maybe some intuition or some new ways of thinking. But then the question, how does this apply to your work? And they
Yeah.
might say, well, this applies in something simple and silly like dipping a paddle into a bucket of beads, but we do real work. How,
Yes. Well, we give a few examples, or we ask them for the examples. Where do you do this at work? And they really quickly can draw the link from that exercise to where the red beads are in their work.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that's profound. And that's how, bit by bit, they are learning. And then that's where we help them with the consulting to help them apply
Hmm.
those new concepts. How does that apply to you? And the faster they learn and apply, they can experience huge transformations in their organization.
Yeah. And there was one time. I mean, I enjoy facilitating the red bead game, and I remember one session. It was a chief medical officer of a health system who was very engaged. I don't think he had a hands-on role, but he was sitting in the front. And I remember when we were talking afterwards about debrief questions and sharing thoughts, and he said, and meant quite seriously, like he said, I'm paraphrasing, but it was very close to saying, every single one of our patient safety or patient harm metrics is red beads because they get so excited anytime the number is a little bit better. They get so discouraged when the number's a little bit worse. They want to reward this team and not reward some other team. And like that was an aha moment. Now, unfortunately, because I was just doing a workshop, I don't know what he and that organization then translated into action. And it sounds like you're helping people kind of through some of that consulting and coaching. turning
Yes.
this into action.
Yes. Because when I work with leaders, executive teams, boards, whoever, I use a 3-phase approach to help them. So first I went to phase 1, assess where are they at today. So I don't do anything cookie cutter. I go in and I assess where are you in your thinking, in your leadership, in your culture, in your communication, and decision making, and um, uh, charting, in your financials, as a system.
Mhm.
So phase 1, where are they at? And then based on that, I design a short, focused, hands-on learning, experiential learning session so that we do exactly the exercises and what did you learn and how does it apply. So when they walk out of the room, they understand their key business issues, they have a plan, they know
Mhm.
who's going to do what, they have teams focused, they are going to look at data in different ways, they're going to create process flows and so forth. And then phase 3 is helping them apply those new ideas that they've learned in a couple of days. And I see personal transformation, new vocabulary, new communication interaction. I had one executive team that came into the room for 2 days, and before we got started, they kept moving around. And I thought, what are they doing?
Mhm.
And I realized, oh, they sat next to somebody and said, oh, I don't want to sit next to that person. Oh, I don't want to sit across from that person. And they kept moving. And I thought, I have never seen this before. What have I gotten myself into? And so we went through the 2 days. They When they had walked in, they judged, blamed, criticized, yelled at each other.
Mhm.
They were not a management team. They were managers who did all
Yeah.
these behaviors. But when they walked out, they hugged each other and
Mhm.
said, "Have a safe drive home."
Yeah.
It was it was
Progress.
an amazing transformation that began, and that company owner had called and said, Marcia, I've got a financially healthy company at 30 million, but I want to take it to 35 or 40 million. And we've got all these problems.
Mhm.
Can you help? And then that's when I took a look at the company. I brought them together for the learning. Then we left. I worked with them for a few years and they went from 30 to 300 million.
Oh, wow.
So
Right.
that is, they had personal transformations. So they came together so supportive of each other like never before. And then they were totally focused on wowing their customer, giving
Mhm.
them the customer experience like never before.
Yeah.
They were ecstatic when
Yeah.
they hit that 300, but it was never a goal. I never let
Sure.
them say, "Oh, we're going to go to 100 million or 200 million." It was just like, I have no idea where you're going.
Right.
This-
Well, I mean, 10x growth is a huge difference than 10% growth, and I'm sure it required transformation to be able to make a leap like that. And your observation is one that I've seen, even in healthcare, calling it a leadership team or a senior leadership team. It's a collection of executives, and they each embody the silo that they're responsible for, and that seems to be a huge impediment to trying to really operate as a health system.
Right.
Again, using that word doesn't necessarily make it true. It's a healthcare organization.
Yeah.
But
I find it interesting that, especially with doctors, they have to look at the body as a system when there's a problem. And in order to cure a person, look at the system. But yet, the way they run their healthcare medical organizations
yeah,
is is not systems thinking at all. It is silos. They talk about change management. They talk about departments,
quality
and
department.
they don't understand what each other's doing. And until they understand system thinking and system optimization, healthcare is going to struggle.
Yeah,
Medical organizations, medical device, whatever, in that sector, or any sector,
yeah,
they will struggle.
yeah. And I mean, a couple of the best healthcare CEOs that I've met and talked to and learned from that are best at thinking about systems are internal medicine specialists, because they are thinking about the person as a system, where there is a trap even then of siloed thinking when it comes to somebody who only works on certain body parts.
Hmm.
I have a friend, it's a quick story, but her husband had a bad bicycle accident and had a broken pelvis and a broken shoulder. And the doctor that was treating and thinking about the recovery of the shoulder advised him to get up out of bed and start walking. And totally, like, his body system was not capable of that.
Right. Oh my
And there
God.
was a different doctor apparently dealing with the aftermath of the broken pelvis.
They were focused on parts that they specialized in
Mm-hmm.
versus the whole. I remember there's a fantastic story that Dr. Russ Akoff shared, and he was working with a city back east, and there was the managers, and they were going around the table saying what the problem was for the city from their perspective. So the it's an economic problem, and it's an engineering problem, and it's a marketing problem, all these things. And he pulled them all back basically and said, it's a problem,
Mm.
a whole. Take
Yeah.
a look at it from the larger perspective, and then think of how do you ask questions and think about this as a whole system. That it's the city the city has a problem for its residents, and then, why is that? It's not a slice, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
overall.
Well, a silo might want to claim the cause of the problem because that silo has a solution that their silo can deliver, instead of thinking about the system. Then, looking at your website and some of the phrases and things that you talk about helping clients with, one of them in the list is identify your problems accurately to problem solve. It seems like you're kind of touching on that there, that if people are framing the problem in a non-systems based way, if they're framing the problem as, I had a card posted, or not a post-it note, but an index card, scribbled some notes from a conversation with someone recently of, like, we might say the problem is low productivity, but they might be defining, so that's a siloed metric, and they might be blaming the workers for not being productive. So you have to help people reframe or accurately frame the problem as what it is without a blaming siloed view, right?
Exactly. So oftentimes people identify this is a problem, but they don't accurately identify a problem, because for one thing, they're looking at the symptoms, and they don't even go to the root causes
Right.
of a problem. So until they even can talk about the root causes, the interdependencies of the causes, that's causing probably not one problem, but probably multiple problems until they can have that discussion and think about what are the assumptions that we're making, what are the beliefs that we have. So they're getting, let's say, lower bad results or lower productivity or losses instead of profits and things like that. But those are all the outcomes, and too much focus is usually on outcomes instead of going all the way back to understand what's the process, what's the what are the causes, what are the, even further back, assumptions and beliefs that we have about this, and what are we trying to accomplish? Because generally between the purpose and the result, there's a lot of complexity and waste that has been built in, and people are, you mentioned the term before, status quo. Oftentimes they say, well, that's the way it is. They accept it because it's what they know, and they don't, quote unquote, change it or improve it because they'll just say, well, we've always done it that way. People won't change because we've always done it that way. Instead of thinking, they have to, leadership, it's up to leadership to say, we need to improve. We need to improve for better results, for customer expectations, for customer experiences, to have a healthy work environment, for hundreds of reasons. But we're only going to, and people are only going to improve together if they believe leadership, if they trust leadership, if leadership communicates effectively, and they see that leadership is also working to make improvements. Because if leaders say one thing and do nothing, there won't be any improvements with the staff either.
Right. I want to ask one other question before I'll pivot to talking. We'll wrap up talking about the book, Pivot, Disrupt, Transform by Marcia Daszko. One of the other things in the list of concepts and things that you work with people on, I'll think back to the red bead game again. It says on your website, accelerate efficient, effective, data-driven decision making. Now, like people have talked a lot the last couple of decades, data-driven decision making. But thinking back to the red bead game, when you fire the bottom 3 red bead producers, that is data driven, but I would say not effective in improving company performance, right?
Right. So what is the system that's been created that is having that output? So if you want to change, I often ask a question, are you getting the results that you want? If not, look back, change the system.
Right.
It's not change the people, not blame the people, which is oftentimes what happens. But if you're not getting the results that you want, it's the system that's producing it, which then goes back another step, which means leadership thinking has to change, because leaders create the system.
Right.
Or leaders create the system, and only leaders can make that change to the system. Yes, and they, this is sometimes controversial in my book, or when I'm talking about it. People love to hold other people accountable. And I say there's a huge difference between accountability and responsibility. Leaders are accountable, and employees or teams are responsible for contributing ideas to improve processes and systems and so forth, but they can't change the system. Only leaders can do that.
Well,
So leaders are accountable.
yeah. I mean, people might be able to continuously improve the bad system, but that's not really what's necessary.
That's
Like
not going
being
to
more,
transform it.
no, I mean, being more efficient with the paddle is not going
Right.
to, that's not a meaningful system change. And when people ask like, okay, how do we filter out the red beads and remove them from the container instead of dumping them back in every time? Like that's an example of a system change. But when you say leaders create the system, or senior leaders are most responsible for the system, I've had people push back and even criticize me for saying, well, okay, you say don't blame the workers, but you're blaming management, and that's bad. Blaming is bad. But I'm like, well, I mean, I think management's in a different situation where they may be beholden to a system like quarterly Wall Street financial expectations or other elements of really big picture system. But didn't mean, I don't know. Should I be defended there a little bit, or is there a chance I'm blaming executives inappropriately or unfairly?
Dr. Deming blamed them.
Yeah,
It's up to leadership.
yeah.
There's no, like he said, there's no substitute for leadership. And if people don't want to lead, don't want to be held accountable, then they shouldn't lead. In fact, if they don't want to be held accountable, they're not leaders. They're executives with titles and positions and lots of money.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for, okay, I feel a little more confident in my position around some of that. Maybe I don't articulate it well, and it leads to
Just quote Dr. Deming and say substitute leadership, or, yeah.
So, Marcia, the book, Pivot, Disrupt, Transform. One thing I was going to ask you, you touched on this earlier. Maybe I can ask you to elaborate here. The 3 fundamental business strategies.
Mm-hmm.
You could tell us a little more about that. And do companies tend to choose? Does that tend to evolve? Is there overlap in these three strategies?
I think many executives adopt hope as a business strategy.
How's that working for them?
Sorry, that hope is not a business strategy, but it's the integration, it's the interconnectedness of quality, continual improvement, and innovation as business strategies. They're interconnected, and you don't do one without the other. Because, for example, you can improve and improve and improve and improve the buggy whip.
Right.
That it doesn't.
The rotary phone.
Yes, it doesn't get you to, the horseless carriage, the car, the electric car, the flying car. It takes innovation as a business strategy. So improvement alone is not a business strategy. So quality alone, we might have great quality today with something, but it doesn't mean it's going to be sustainable unless we're doing continual improvement.
Mm-hmm. And you think of Silicon Valley companies. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Apple products. They tend to delight me and serve me well most of the time. I think Apple, quality, continual improvement, and innovation. I'm not rushing out to buy this new headset innovation, but for my purposes, I mean, there. I think there are companies. Even I'm thinking California again. I don't know if you eat In-N-Out Burger.
Yes,
I mean, I think
it's popular. It always has a long line.
Yeah. There's quality and continual improvement. I don't know how much innovation, but there's been, I think, innovation around process and how well they manage those drive-through lines compared to what there's some innovative practices, even if it's not an innovative product, right?
Yes. And they'll, over time, maybe they're stable. I don't know about their business intimately enough to speak to it, but maybe they have stability right now and they have a mindset of continual improvement. And then at some point they may have to think about innovation. I think McDonald's has had to go through that somewhat.
McDonald's seems, to make attempts at innovation and new
Right.
product development. Some fast food chains are always introducing something new, and then In-N-Out, I think, is kind of locked in on like, hey, this is what we do, and we do it well. I think their fries are a little bland. There's opportunity for continual improvement. I was going to ask you, Deming people tend to use the phrase continual improvement. Do you nitpick about the phrase continuous improvement? Is that nails on the chalkboard to you, or you're like, it's as long as you're improving?
I'm used to it. It's better than nothing. But it's interesting because I was at the reunion for the Into Thinking Network's get together Saturday in Southern California. There, I was thinking today, what year did we co-found that nonprofit? And it was over 15 years ago. And based on Dr. Deming's philosophy of management, Dr. Russ Akoff, Dr. Taguchi, and the loss function, several people foundational to, new management thinking, a better management philosophy. We started that, 5 of us co-founded that organization. And then we decided to, get together. About 50 people had a reunion on Saturday, and that I facilitated an open space session so that people could have conversations, pretty deep conversations about any topic they wanted to. And I remember that topic came out about what is the difference between continual and continuous. And don't ask me to repeat that answer, but it had something to do with discontinuous and continuous concepts in physics.
Yeah.
And I recall that my friend Mike Beck explained it, to someone else, and I was listening and I'm like, well, I didn't study physics, but I understood it, and I understood enough to be able to say, yeah, I'm good with continual. I remember Dr. Deming saying that use continual, not continuous. So I've been good with that.
Okay. Well, Marcia, I want to ask one other question. Looking at some of the talks that you give, one of those talks is titled using part of, I think, a pretty famous Deming quote, "Survival is optional." So maybe as a final question here, kind of tell us about that phrase and that idea and what it means to you and the companies that you're helping. Survival is optional.
And this is based on the theme of my book too, and that is there's a fork in the road, and executives can take one fork, which is full of management fads and trends and the next shiny thing and quote unquote best practices, and they can be followers of what everybody has done before. And, oh, I have a company, so now we're adding, performance management and holding individuals accountable and arbitrary numerical goals and all these things. We're going to follow that path. That is a path to destruction over time, sometimes slow, sometimes fast. We've got 90% of startup companies fail.
Right.
And we've seen over 70% of Fortune 500 companies fail. Why is that? Because they took that path, a good part of it. Other people, leaders who want to lead people and manage systems with a new philosophy of management based on a theoretical foundation of management thinking that Dr. Deming taught. If they take that path, they will also have challenges asking questions about beliefs and assumptions and customers, and how do we create better experiences, and how do we work together, better as a team? What's our constancy of purpose? By what method? What do we stand for in actions and behaviors, not just words? So a whole strategic compass that I developed that helps leaders continually improve and innovate and create new markets and create new healthy organizations, and hopefully contribute to a healthier society. So that's where survival is optional. They have a choice. Do you want to be lazy and grab on to the old ways of doing things, or do you seriously want to lead people? And it means being a provocative thinker and continually learning. And the leaders, the executives who tend to have more success will create learning organizations. They will invest in their people. They will look for creativity. They're not afraid to have town hall meetings, for example, and listen to their people, and who are full of ideas, and then try new things.
Yeah.
So like you talked about, with your latest book about the mistakes that make us, making mistakes is a step in the learning journey, and we all have to be part of learning journeys and let go of those. We take the lessons forward and we let mistakes, go to the past, because that's how we get to experience new futures.
Yeah. That's very well said. And thank you for mentioning the book. And you made me think of a phrase. Timothy Clark, who did a blurb for the book, says here, making mistakes is not a choice. Learning from them is. So you'd like to think learning wouldn't be optional. Back to your point and Dr. Deming's point, it is optional. Survival is optional. Progress and innovation are optional, but hopefully that's the option people choose.
Exactly. Yes. If fear doesn't get in their way, or arrogance, I find that I can work with. I look to work with people who are open to learning and committed to that, and have the courage to apply new learning. If they don't have those qualities, I can't really help them.
Yeah. Well, Marcia, I think we'll end it on that note. We've been joined again here today by Marcia Daszko. This has been provocative and thought-provoking, and it's been fun. Thank you for your stories and your insights. I feel like we could probably do another whole long discussion on why change management is a fad and why you don't like that. But maybe a topic for another day. But I will put links to Marcia's website in the show notes. The book, her most recent book, again, is Pivot, Disrupt, Transform: How Leaders Beat the Odds and Survive. Marcia, I'm really glad we could do this. Thank you for being my guest here.
Thank you for having me. I just really enjoyed this conversation. I love when we can have a robust conversation and kind of really dig into the concepts. It's fun.
Yeah,
thank you.
It was. Thank you for that.